At the inquest, Ted detailed the moment before losing control. He put Mary Jo in the passenger seat. I recall the movement of Mary Jo next to me, the struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me. And I, at this time, opened my eyes and realized I was upside down, that water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black, and I was able to get a half gulp, I would say, of air before I became completely immersed in the water. I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of the car. I can remember the last sensation of being completely out of air and inhaling what must have been half a lungful of water and assuming that I was going to drown. And the full realization that no one was going to be looking for us until the next morning, that I wasn't going to be able to get out of the car alive, and that somehow coming up to the last energy of just pushing, pressing, and coming up to the surface, I have no idea in the world how I got out of that car. Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell. We are going through Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not, about the Kennedys and the women destroyed by them. Today, we have a big story, and actually, I feel like that is going to be true as far as I can see. I've done some pre-reading up in the mountains. I am super excited to share these stories with you. Today's story is perhaps one of the most well-known tragedies that involves a Kennedy. I have my little chart. I will bring it up to you. We are going to be talking about this youngest Kennedy, Ted Kennedy. There were 4 Kennedy sons. There are only 2 remaining, and by the end of the story, he is the final Kennedy son that's living. So we are going to get right into our reading today because we have a lot to do. Here we go. Today we are talking about Mary Jo Kopechne. This starts out a section of 2 chapters called Ted's Blondes. So, Mary Jo Kopechne. He didn't even know how to spell her last name. While he stood behind Police Chief Jim Arena's desk, to Arena's surprise, Ted Kennedy was already running this investigation. Making calls on his phone, he struggled to formally identify the young woman whom he had left in his car the night before. A car he had left upside down in 3 feet of water after careening off a bridge. 3 feet of water, a detail we're going to want to remember. Her name was Mary Jo. Ted could pronounce her last name, kind of, but he didn't know how to spell Kopechne. So Ted, when he wrote out his statement, just left that part blank. It wasn't important, really. The news reports to follow would only prove Ted right. In headline after headline, this would be called Ted's Accident. And how lucky America was that the Senator, Ted Kennedy, survived, narrowly escaping the Kennedy curse. Teddy escapes, blonde drowns. And there's a picture of Mary Jo Kopechne, not even honored by her name. Kennedy car runs off bridge was that subtitle. Decades later, even into the new millennium, historians and journalists and pundits would call this scandal, this callous disregard for human life, not by the dead woman's name, but by its location, Chappaquidick, a small Massachusetts island off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Before Ted calmly reported himself to Arena that morning, he had first called Mary Jo's parents. It was Saturday, July 19th, 1969, a momentous weekend for the Kennedys. 3 American astronauts were hurtling toward the moon, a seemingly impossible goal that had been set forth by his big brother, JFK, in his 1961 inaugural address. If they survived, they would land on the moon's surface shortly before 11 p.m. that night. The eyes of the world were glued to live broadcasts with 53 million Americans watching. The goings-on at some tiny shack in Martha's Vineyard were, at the moment, inconsequential. Mary Jo's mother, Gwen, answered the phone. Ted wanted to talk to her husband instead. Jo Kopechne wasn't home, but no matter. Gwen could tell something was very wrong. She would not be getting off that phone. Mary Jo, he said, was in an accident. Was it a car? It was an automobile accident, Ted said. Mary Jo was returning to take a ferry back to the mainland when the accident occurred. This language was too passive, too officious. Gwen cut right to the point. Was her daughter dead? He paused. Yes. Mary Jo had been her only child. Ted Kennedy gave Mary Jo's parents no details. They didn't know that Ted had been driving. They didn't know he had an expired license, had been drinking heavily, and had pitched his car, their daughter inside, into the shallow waters 10 hours before. They didn't know that he had emerged from the water and walked over a mile, passing by several houses, at least one of them with the lights on, never knocking for help. Or that he had passed the local firehouse, or that he had bypassed payphones and never called the police or 911. Her parents didn't know that the very next morning, members of his staff could still smell alcohol on Ted's breath, or that their daughter had been alive for hours, tossed upon impact into the back of the car, contorting herself upside down in the rear footwell, clutching at the back seat and craning her neck to breathe through a small air pocket. John Ferrer, the diver who pulled her body out of the car, quickly determined that she had probably lived for at least an hour after the crash, and that had Ted gotten help, Mary Jo could have been saved. Later, Ferrer described Mary Jo as having been alone in the dark water, rebreathing her own air, the oxygen turning to carbon dioxide. This makes me furious. This whole story strikes at the heart of the selfish Kennedy tendency to prioritize one's own political career and protection over protection of others, completely devaluing the women involved. There. I forgot to open the window. Normally I film now at night, but my husband took the children to the pool for the afternoon. So we have a nice bright afternoon to read together. Who would leave a young woman to die that way? Ted Kennedy would. After leaving the scene, the married senator went back to his hotel in Edgartown, where he made 17 long-distance phone calls to friends, advisors, his brother-in-law, Steve Smith, who was known as the Kennedy family fixer, and Helga Wagner, who friends described as the love of Ted's life. So not his wife, who he's married to, which of course he doesn't care about her because he's already alone at midnight with some other woman on an island, which, regardless of what you think about whether or not there was anything intimate happening between them, to be out at midnight with someone so much younger than you of the opposite sex when your pregnant wife is home, it's just appalling behavior for any human. But then you add in that he is a married senator. The lack of judgment here is just everywhere. Every decision is poor judgment, poor judgment, poor judgment. So now he's calling the love of his life to we don't know what was said in this conversation, but that's one of the 17 long distance phone calls he made while he was not calling the local police or emergency crews to go help this poor woman who he knew was in the back seat. Around 2:30 in the morning, Ted complained to the front desk about guests in a nearby room who were having a party. The noise, he said, was disturbing his sleep. A couple of thoughts about this. Trying not to add my thoughts, but this is hard. This is all about him, isn't it? And I actually think perhaps what he was doing, I'd love for you to tell me if you agree. I wonder if this is his kind of weaselly way of striking at the option of having an alibi. I don't know. I'm just imagining him in that hotel room. He's already showered. He's gotten himself into clean clothes, and he's thinking, okay, if I was really here all night and not there, then what would be happening? Oh, I hear those noises. That's an option. And then that hotel clerk could verify that I was here at 2:30, and that would give me an alibi. That's my idea of what was happening here. Otherwise, I don't know why he would go and do this. Well, Gwen and Jo Kopechne didn't know that the men in suits who quickly arrived at their home in New Jersey were all tried and true Kennedy men. These were the cleanup crew. They were there not to protect the Kopechnes from the press, like they claimed, but to make sure that Ted Kennedy emerged from this disaster with his bright future intact. Ted needed to walk away from this with no felony charge, no criminal or civil trial, no prison time, no reputational damage whatsoever. He needed a clean path to his rightful inheritance, the Oval Office. The girl, as Ted would call her, well, she was collateral damage. So the Kennedy fix-up crew has arrived, and they're there to protect Ted. I wonder now if you all are hearing the repetition of the theme like I am, that there is an inherent part of this family system that is just protect the candidate, protect the candidate, protect the candidate, and it is built into how they operate. So we see that happening here. Mary Jo had thought little of Ted Kennedy. As everyone on the Hill knew, Ted was a legendary drunk and womanizer who cheapened high office and degraded the slain president's legacy. She deeply admired Jack Kennedy, but it was Bobby whom she had really come to DC for. Bobby she loved. She had worked for him in the Senate, babysat his children, went to Hickory Hill, his and Ethel's famed house in Virginia. So she went there. She loved his children, Bobby Jr. especially, and Bobby Jr. loved Mary Jo. She was so good with the children and so conscientious that Ethel had asked her about taking on a nanny role. But Ethel had miscalculated. Yes, there was a part of Mary Jo that was deeply old-fashioned. She was a devout Roman Catholic and comported herself with modesty. She barely drank, she didn't smoke or appreciate bawdy humor, but she was ambitious and independent, and she was determined to carve out a path that felt right for her. She was the first in her family to graduate from college. Sex was a mystery to Mary Jo. Her church made it something to fear. She didn't have any siblings, so there was no one older to guide her and no one to rebel with. She didn't talk about sex with any of her friends, so no one she worked with knew her very well. And even her friends or boyfriends didn't feel that they knew her very well. But she did like a party and she loved to dance, and that was the only time anyone saw her out of control and unself-aware. Her dancing had a ferocity to it, as if she suppressed everything until that one single socially acceptable time when it could escape. It was a burden at times being an only child, especially a girl. Her parents worried over her, and at one point when she told them she wanted to go teach at an Indian reservation, they begged her not to go. And she ended up changing her mind, and she got a job teaching at a Catholic high school in Montgomery, Alabama. She was 22 years old, and like so many young Americans, she was a study in contrast. She seemed meek, but was driven. She was humble and grounded, yet also drawn to the glamour of the Kennedys. She was fearless when it came to her beliefs, and remaining a virgin until marriage was paramount to her, no matter how many men had broken up with her over that stance. Her devotion to God, to the Catholic Church, and to Bobby Kennedy, in that order, meant that there would be no sex for this single girl who otherwise, in so many ways, was ahead of her time. She considered her year teaching in Montgomery a kind of tithing, a spiritual gift of service and sacrifice before moving on to the larger goal of working for social justice on Capitol Hill, ideally for Bobby Kennedy. Her hope was that eventually she would help him get to the White House. To her, he was the country's best hope. It was he alone of all the Kennedys and of all the politicians who cared about the same things that she did: poverty, racism, and social inequity. She called Bobby the answer. Late summer 1963. So this is before Kennedy's assassination, just a few months before. Mary Jo's year of teaching had left her emotionally depleted. She told her mother that she hadn't yet figured out how to help others while protecting herself. She didn't know how to share her talents, her essential goodness, without giving people her entire being. When was it kind to herself and others to say no? Let's pause here just for a second, because this is such a good question, and I think it's something that a lot of women struggle with, because women tend to be more naturally empathetic. We tend to have more of that maternal or the ability to be anxious on other people's behalf that we care about. We tend to carry burdens for others in a way that's often different from men. Not that men can't do it, not that all women do, but we generally tend to have this. And so this is such a good question of, when is it kind to others to say no? I know for me as a mother, that's something that I've had to continually relearn, in postpartum seasons, for example, to learn it's actually better for the whole household if I rest for a solid, really 2 weeks, at least a solid week in bed. And I'm past that season now. My youngest is 6. But, different seasons of motherhood have required that I learn how to say no to certain things so that I'm okay for others, and that it's actually kindest to others and kindest to myself to draw those boundaries or say no or be willing to draw a sharp line so that I have enough margin for the things that actually matter in life. And so Mary Jo is hitting this as a young woman and trying to find her way through that conundrum. When she arrived in Washington that summer, she had hoped to work for President Kennedy. But Mary Jo didn't have that upper class sheen from boarding school and world traveler, that jet set crowd that appealed to the JFK world. She wasn't like Mimi or Diana DeVeg. She didn't give off a knowing vibe, much less an available one. So instead, she was offered positions with 2 other congressmen. She was offered a job with Smathers, and you might remember that name from the one who had gone off to the Med to float on a boat with then Senator Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, when she had a stillbirth with baby Arabella. So you might remember Senator Smathers from that time. Well, she's offered a job, but she really wants to work for Bobby. So she persuades Smathers to let her go work for Bobby instead. Well, Mary Jo worked harder for Bobby than she had for her beloved students. She rose quickly from secretary to advance woman, in charge of staging campaign stops to speech writing aide. And eventually she was one of 6 of the so-called boiler room girls. We're going to hear this term a lot, so just note that. Boiler room girls. They were known because they toiled in a windowless upstairs chamber as they tracked delegates around the country. So they were the boiler room girls. They were in a room with no windows, and they were just working nonstop to coordinate campaign management for Bobby. And now this happens all the time on campaigns, but this was a little bit ahead of its time, and it was certainly unusual to have a bunch of young ladies doing it. So they worked up policy positions. They gathered and synthesized the kind of data that Barack Obama's team would later use with much greater technology to win the White House. For her work, which extended to nights and weekends, she earned $7,500 a year. Her male counterparts were earning twice that. Mary Jo was Bobby's star, the sharpest and most dedicated of his junior staff. She was so pretty that her office name was Twiggy. Twiggy was that ultra-mod, doe-eyed model of that time. Behind her back, the other women called her a prude. Yet, as Bobby's profile ramped up and his candidacy was announced for president, rumors began to circulate in both New York and D.C. that Bobby and Mary Jo were having an affair. It wasn't that outlandish. Mary Jo and Bobby did travel together while campaigning, and they did stay in the same hotels. It was no secret that Mary Jo was in love with Bobby. The men she dated knew they couldn't compare to him. For Mary Jo, Bobby Kennedy and whatever he or his family needed came first. One boyfriend told her father, "She'll never marry me. She's married to the Kennedys." And the boyfriend was right. If Mary Jo heard the rumors about her and Bobby sleeping together, she never said a thing. Mary Jo knew her value, and she knew that if Bobby won the White House, there was no doubt he'd be taking her along with him. How many junior male staffers did Bobby hold in similar esteem? She was the one weighing in on each draft of his speeches. She was the one who could mock him and get away with it. Mary Jo's irreverence and self-deprecation delighted him. She wasn't trying to be cool, and she had a guileless view of the world. There was right and there was wrong. There was good and evil. To her, Bobby was all good. And so he spared Mary Jo from seeing the worst of himself. Even with this black and white view of the world, she was born for politics, and she understood all that came with it: the compromise, moral and otherwise, the massaging of inconvenient truths, the power of images, and how to manipulate them. In the fall of 1966, it was Mary Jo who figured out that Bobby's designated speaking location needed to be moved so that television cameras would capture even a small crowd looking like 10,000 fans. So she is helping to give him craft this popular image for the public, and she's learning how to do it in real time, and he's trusting her to do it. June 5th, 1968. So now we've fast forwarded 5 years from that early summer when she went to work for him. Los Angeles, 12:02 a.m. Mary Jo was at the Ambassador Hotel when Bobby finished addressing his supporters in the Embassy Ballroom. The California primary results were in, and Bobby was the leading Democratic candidate, ahead of his nearest rival by 7%. Lyndon Johnson, who had succeeded Jack after the assassination, had announced that he would not be seeking a second term. The nation was too against him because of the Vietnam War, and had also been traumatized by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on a Memphis hotel balcony just 2 months prior to this date in June. Bobby was poised to be a bookend of healing, the younger Kennedy brother, preaching the message of unity and grace. It was Bobby who had broken the news of Martin Luther King's death to a largely black crowd of thousands in Indianapolis. Wearing a black overcoat that had belonged to Jack, Bobby told the crowd, "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people." It was a speech Bobby himself had cobbled together on the fly, yet it was the most heartfelt and impactful of his political career. It was this kind of humanity that was going to make him the next president of the United States. So we see why Mary Jo, with her compassion and her desire for the greater good, would be drawn to someone who gives speeches like this and for whom this was his heartbeat. He has this grandiose view of what he can do, and yet you can see why people would believe that perhaps this man can actually do this. That whereas LBJ has come in and ushered us into this war, that RFK may take us back to a simpler time pre the 1963 assassination and the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King. And maybe he can be someone who reaches out across racial lines and desires this unity that we all perceive our country needs, right? So you can see why this would be appealing to many and why he had the lead in the Democratic nomination. "So my thanks to all of you," Bobby said in his LA victory speech, "and on to Chicago, and let's win there." It was his last line of the night, the crowd at the Ambassador going crazy for him, chanting, "We want Bobby," over and over. He was meant to be safe among his own people, yet two of America's most prominent Black athletes, both friends of Bobby, had volunteered to bodyguard him that night. They volunteered. So there must have been a feeling of kinship and kindness from these Black athletes toward him that they would volunteer their time in this way. Rayford Johnson, the two-time Olympic decathlete, and former NFL lineman Rosie Greer. Probably Greer. Y'all can tell me in the comments. Despite what had happened to Jack, presidential candidates were still not afforded Secret Service protection. So this was prior to what happens now. Now, if you're the major party candidate, you immediately get, once you've passed the number of delegates that you need in order to be the Republican or Democrat candidate, you immediately are afforded Secret Service protection from that point forward. At this point, presidential candidates were not given that. Bobby began making his way back to the hotel's back exit through the kitchen. Ethel, who had been by his side as he spoke, was trailing just behind. Reporters, busboys, kitchen staff were all around, as well as photographers and television cameras. The dispersing crowd outside could hear what sounded like a thump, but no one blanched. They were still chanting, RFK, RFK. The thump had been the first of 3 gunshots. Now Bobby Kennedy lay on the kitchen floor, bleeding, as Johnson and Greer subdued the gunman. A 17-year-old immigrant busboy from Mexico named Juan Romero cradled Bobby's head as he struggled to speak. "Is everybody okay?" he asked. His blood was pouring through Romero's fingers. "Yes," Romero said, "everybody's okay." He took out his own rosary from his shirt pocket and wrapped it around Bobby's right hand while holding Bobby's head off the cold concrete floor. Bobby turned his head slightly. "Everything's going to be okay," he said. On June 6th at 1:44 a.m., after one day in an intensive care at LA's Good Samaritan Hospital, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He had been shot 3 times, the fatal bullet through his head. His assassin, Sirhan, later said he killed Bobby for his pro-Israel views and for contributing to the persecution of Palestinians. Well, I'm going to pause here because actually this morning I was listening to, and I had forgotten, it was not connected, I was not watching it because of this. I had forgotten that this was this episode. But I was listening to a wonderful video by Chase Hughes. He is a body language expert who has worked in government and military and business settings for decades, studying body language for the purpose of intelligence and military strategy. He applies those things now for the benefit of the public. He has a YouTube channel with 3 other men, the Body Language Panel, and I love watching their stuff. But Chase Hughes also has his own YouTube channel, and it was served up to me on YouTube this morning. It's a 1-hour conversation about whether or not Sirhan was actually the assassin, and about whether or not it's possible through mental manipulation to program someone toward violent action, specifically assassination. I will also link to that in the show notes. Back to our reading. Now, Bobby's death was yet another national trauma. His campaign, which had prioritized civil rights and the eradication of poverty, had been a balm after the assassinations of JFK and MLK. Bobby Kennedy had allowed and even encouraged America to look forward to the future with hope and to reject the carnage of the 1960s, but now he was a victim of that carnage. So now we're to June 1968, post RFK's assassination. Mary Jo's grief in the wake of his death was even more paralyzing than when JFK had been killed in 1963. She traveled on Bobby's funeral train. She helped pack up his office, and that took months. One day she sat at her desk for hours, staring straight ahead and not moving, not saying a word, leaving her colleagues to ask if she needed some help getting home. When all that work was done, Mary Jo Kopechne, rising star, moved away from DC. She didn't want to be there without Bobby Kennedy. "I just feel Bobby's presence everywhere," she said. "I can't go back because it will never be the same again." Whom would she work for? Certainly not Ted. He was the unserious runt of the Kennedy litter, kicked out of Harvard for cheating. His sweet, beautiful wife, Joan, served two purposes for him: as a stay-home mother to their 3 children and as a campaign prop. Mary Jo knew Joan and liked her and thought she was so kind and pretty, but also pitied her because she surely had heard about all of Ted's other women. As it was, everyone thought Mary Jo was too worshipful around the Kennedys, but anyone who wasn't blood would never truly be one of them, as her story shows. Now only Ted was left, the youngest of all of Rose and old Joe's children. But there were other girls, but they were not seen as viable for political service. So Ted is their one last hope. Well, Mary Jo did not want to work for him or advise him, and she certainly didn't want to date him. So it jumps to Martha's Vineyard, June 19th, 1969. This is 1 year after RFK was assassinated. The Boiler Room girls, along with some older male Kennedy loyalists, were all gathering to mourn Bobby and commemorate all that they had done for him. Mary Jo had been working for a different politician, but she found someone to take her place, and she called her mom right before heading up to Martha's Vineyard. She had big news to share, she said, 3 major life decisions that she had just made. One was that she had been offered a job at one of the top firms for political consulting. They were doubling her salary, and she was taking it. Her career was heading exactly where she wanted it to go. But then Joe picked up the phone in another room, and suddenly the dynamic was off. Whatever else Mary Jo had to confide, we don't know what the other pieces of news were, and her mother doesn't either. Whatever else she had to share, she kept it to herself once her father joined the call. The party on the vineyard that Saturday night was sad all around, and later, when it became the subject of news reports and speculation, much would be made of all these young single girls drinking and carousing with older married men. So many questions as to the character of these women, and Mary Jo especially. Were they drunk? Sleeping with Ted Kennedy or his staff? What was Mary Jo doing, going off alone in a car with Ted Kennedy, midnight approaching, leaving her handbag and her hotel room key behind? This was one of the key pieces of evidence that could help us think through what her motives were or what was happening in this situation, that her handbag and her hotel room key are still in this little shack on the Chappaquidick Island when she goes away with Ted in the car. What could Ted and Mary Jo possibly have been doing between the time they left the party and the time an eyewitness saw Ted's car heading toward the ferry an hour and a half later, around 11:20 p.m.? Why was alcohol found in her system? Hadn't everyone who had known her said that Mary Jo hardly ever drank? Which was it then? Was she the perfect Catholic girl, little angel, or a secret party girl with a Kennedy fixation? Ted said she had asked to leave with him, so clearly she was after one thing, right? And somehow the detail leaks that Mary Jo's body was found without underwear. And then that got people's tongues wagging, because didn't that say it all? It didn't matter that the tests for sperm came back negative. All these contradictions led the Massachusetts Southern District Attorney Edward Dennis to request 2 months later an exhumation of Mary Jo's body for an autopsy. But Mary Jo's mom was horrified. I don't want my little girl's body dug up, my tiny, lovely little baby. Mary Jo was left in the water for 9 hours, she said. She didn't belong there. Ted had been drinking the afternoon of the crash, sailing in a regatta. That evening he had taken a bath, had his 4th rum and coke, and then began making his way over to the small 2-bedroom rented cottage in Chappaquidick, where this gathering was in effect. The mourners drinking and smoking cigarettes in this Spartan, dingy house. The grill was so tiny that everyone settled for sausage and cheese hors d'oeuvres. There wasn't even any music, so one of the girls had to venture into town to try to find a radio. Really, it was a bunch of sad, middle-aged men moping around and drinking heavily. Hardly the kind of grand affair one would associate with the Kennedys. But to Ted, as always, a party was a party. This seems so creepy, doesn't it? Like, you've got these 30-something Kennedy men who are married, most of them, and then you've got these 20-something young ladies who had been associated with presidential campaigns and had been, and clearly were desirable for political consulting. They knew their stuff. They were women who had accomplished a lot for an important candidate. And so they're all just in this seedy little 2-bedroom cottage. I don't know, too, like just being near a beach. I'm like, it's sandy. It probably is grubby. They're drinking, smoking. It just sounds disgusting to me. Honestly, it sounds like no fun. It sounds like something that a 17-year-old would perceive as fun, but not 20 and 30 something people who had accomplished a lot in their life. It just seems a little bit cuckoo to me. A pretty young blonde, though, was a pretty young blonde. And this one had asked him for a ride back to the inn. Or had she? That was his testimony given at the inquest on January 5th, 1970. So this is 6-7 months after the crash. He's in an inquest. And this is his quote. "She indicated to me that she was desirous of leaving, if I would be kind enough to drop her back at the hotel." Mary Jo's close friends doubted that. They thought it far more likely that Mary Jo, who had said she felt queasy from too much sun that afternoon, went into the back seat of the black Oldsmobile to nap, and that Ted was drunk and unaware that she was even in the car when he took off. That, they said, was the more likely explanation as to why her handbag and hotel room key had been left behind in the little shack. Mary Jo, who was a stickler for details, had not intended to leave. Then again, maybe Mary Jo had asked for that ride. The last ferry from Chappaquidick to Edgartown left at midnight. Maybe she looked around and saw that no one else was in the mood to leave and hadn't wanted to crash on a hard, dirty floor. Maybe in her haste, she simply forgot her bag and key. Perhaps she had gone with him. I definitely want you guys to weigh in the comments about which thing you think is true, what you think her motive is. Whether or not she knowingly left, whether there was some other intimate reason, or whether there was something else going on. Well, on the way back to the ferry that night, Ted was going over the 20-mile-per-hour limit. He was flying down Chappaquidick Road before veering onto a dirt path called Dyke Bridge Road. It was rough and narrow, a road to nowhere. Ted was gunning the car so fast that by the time he felt the road give way beneath him, tires rolling over the planked wood bridge, no guardrail on either side, he had steered his black Oldsmobile Delmont 88 off the right side and plunged into the water, where the car landed upside down. The force of impact caved in the windshield. At the inquest, Ted detailed the moment before losing control. He put Mary Jo in the passenger seat. "I recall the movement of Mary Jo next to me, the struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me. And I, at this time, opened my eyes and realized I was upside down, that water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black, and I was able to get a half gulp, I would say, of air before I became completely immersed in the water. I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of the car. I can remember the last sensation of being completely out of air and inhaling what must have been half a lungful of water and assuming that I was going to drown. And the full realization that no one was going to be looking for us until the next morning, that I wasn't going to be able to get out of the car alive, and that somehow coming up to the last energy of just pushing, pressing, and coming up to the surface, I have no idea in the world how I got out of that car." One thing I want to point out about this testimony is that he here is self-condemning. He says in the middle of all of this, when he's got a half gulp of air, it's about to take a half a lung of water, which all of his language sounds so formal. It's irritating because this is a man who's cheating on his wife, having conversations with his mistress, off at midnight with some blonde on an island. he's not a man who is actually respectable, but he's taking on the veneer of respectable language. Well, in the middle of his little inquest, though, he kind of has a tell. He says, I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of the car. So even according to his own words, he had the sensation from the very beginning that the two of them needed to get out of the car. So let's see what else happens. Mary Jo was still alive. If Ted, strapping, athletic, 6'2" Ted, an excellent swimmer, could get himself out, then surely he could rescue Mary Jo. Well, he tried, he said. The water only came up to his waist, and he said he dove in again and again. I was doing everything that I possibly could to get the girl out of the car, Ted said. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but I do have a train that goes near the house, so we might hear that. The girl, the blonde, the next day's headlines, Teddy escapes, blonde drowns. Those words were buried under the top story of the day. JFK's dream realized. The front pages of every newspaper in America. Men walk on moon. If you guys haven't seen it, I'll just give a little plug right now to the movie Chappaquidick. It came out several years ago. They do a really excellent job of evoking the visuals of that era and giving the particulars of Teddy's movements and decisions that day, while still, I think, leaving something vague about, they don't necessarily try to answer all the questions about what the motives were and what actually happened. I think they do a good job of sticking to the facts. Well, in that movie, they make it super clear that basically the men landing on the moon the exact same weekend as this event saves Teddy's bacon. This is what makes it to where he is given just enough breathing room to get out of this conundrum. He's still testifying. My head was throbbing and my neck was aching. I was breathless and at that time, hopelessly exhausted. He said he gave up and floated the 50 or so feet to shore and then rested for about 20 minutes before jumping back in. Not to rescue Mary Jo, who was still struggling to breathe, but to swim the length of 2.5 football fields through a tide that he later called brutal back to shore. Once he was there, he passed several cottages, some of them with their lights still on, and ran all the way back to the party house. There he stood, dripping wet, issuing one command. Get me Markham. This was Senator Paul Markham, a former U.S. prosecutor for Massachusetts. He was Ted's other fixer. Ted's cousin, Joey Gargan, was also summoned. There's been a terrible accident, Ted said. The car has gone off the bridge down by the beach, and Mary Jo is in it. The three men piled into a Plymouth Valiant parked outside and raced to the scene. Gargan and Markham both strip down and they go into the pond, while Ted stands on the bridge and watches as they try to save Mary Jo. But they were not trained first responders, and they had no idea how to execute a water rescue. Oh my God, Ted said, looking up at the night sky. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? He is so selfish. He can't even, I mean, look, I think every human, when we find ourselves in a tight spot where we know we're going to get in trouble, we all have this thought, what am I going to do? But almost all of us would have enough decorum and sense of the moment to withhold that thought from coming to the forefront at this particular moment. Maybe the next day, maybe 3 hours later after you've retrieved her body or after you've either saved her or done all you can, then you get to the point of, oh gosh, what are we gonna do? But he, before getting to the point of helping her, he's already jumped to the point of, oh no, I'm in serious, serious trouble. So it jumps ahead a week. Against the advice of their smartest Kennedy advisors, Ted decides to give an emergency televised address 1 week after the crash. For most of these men, this point in time was a real reckoning with their commitment to the Kennedys. They began waking up to the complete horror show of Ted's moral compass. They were all repulsed when Ted asked why he couldn't just say that Mary Jo had been the one driving that night. JFK's most venerated speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, who ends up regretting it, writes this speech. And I'm just going to read sections of this speech. I made immediate and repeated efforts to save Mary Jo by diving into the strong and murky current, but succeeded only in increasing my state of utter exhaustion and alarm. My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all. Well, Teddy, you're not the only one. They don't make any sense to me either. Although my doctors informed me that I suffered a cerebral concussion as well as shock, I do not seek to escape responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical or emotional trauma brought on by the accident or to anyone else. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately. Well, that's good. Instead of looking directly for a telephone after lying exhausted in the grass for an undetermined time, I walked back to the cottage where the party was being held and requested the help of 2 friends and directed them to return immediately to the scene with me in order to undertake a new effort to dive down and locate Miss Kopechne. I just want to say this whole dive down business, I'm sure they had to go down some degree, but this water is 3 feet tall. My little kids could stand up and have their heads out of that water. That's not that deep of water. And so she's there in 3 feet of water in an upside down car. Yes, they had to get down, but dive down, I think, is not so much to give an accurate representation. This is to present an image, an impression that this was somehow way more difficult than it actually was. The car landed on its top, it's in waist-high water, and so if they can't effect the sort of retrieval that ought to be happening, they ought to have gone to one of the nearby houses and called, but they don't. He goes on with his statement. All kinds of scrambled thoughts, all of them confused, some of them irrational, many of them which I cannot recall, some of which I would not have seriously entertained under normal circumstances, went through my mind during this period. I wonder if this right here is him kind of saying, like, I even kind of thought about taking my own life, guys. I don't know. You guys tell me, but I thought when he said thoughts, confused, irrational, some of which I would not have seriously entertained under normal circumstances. I wonder if that's him trying to get the public to think, oh, poor Teddy. He thought about taking his own life. That's so sad. Because this is the kind of selfish man, a big baby that we are being presented with. Somebody who does not have compassion for the young woman, is thinking only of himself, lays around on the beach for 20 minutes when he knows, when he himself in his own words said that he thought Mary Jo and I have to get out of here. He's just laying around for 20 minutes. Today, as I mentioned, I felt morally obligated to plead guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident. No words on my part can possibly express the terrible pain and suffering I feel over this tragic incident. This week has been an agonizing one for me and for the members of my family. Blech. It's not you we're worried about, Teddy. It's the poor Kopechnes who lost their only daughter. That's who we care about. This is such a jerk move. This is such a ridiculous thing for him to be saying. It's been an agonizing week for me and my family. He still has to try to, oh, maybe I was going to commit suicide. Oh, it's been an agonizing week for me and my family. Ugh. Anyway, back to reading. Of course, Ted Sorensen forever regretted writing that speech. And after its broadcast, polls showed that 51% of Americans did not believe him. I'm surprised it's that low. This guy, how has he fooled 49% of the population? At the inquest, John Ferrer, the diver who had recovered Mary Jo's body the next afternoon, testified that Mary Jo had not drowned, but had suffocated to death. He said that she had been alive for at least an hour in the water, maybe longer. That didn't matter to Ted. He was sticking to his story. Was there any particular reason, the prosecutor asked Ted, why you did not call either the police or the fire department? Well, he said, I intended to call for assistance and report the accident to police within a few short moments of going back to the car. Did something transpire to prevent this? Ted dodged the question. Instead, he became most talkative about his own physical pain, self-pity, fear, and a childlike belief that the whole problem would just go away. He was afraid to call her mother, he said. I just couldn't gain the strength within me, the moral strength, to call Mrs. Kopechne at 2 a.m. and tell her that her daughter was dead. Well, instead, he called Helga Wagner, his mistress, love of his life. And remember, then he goes back to his room at the inn, complaining to the front desk about the loud party. Next day, for breakfast, multiple witnesses see him there at breakfast, freshly showered and shaved, neatly dressed, composed, and with a healthy appetite, all before he has notified the police. He insisted he had not slept the night before. He was tossing and turning and pacing, overwhelmed by the tragedy and loss of a very devoted friend. Well, we see the Kennedy machine in this next little vignette. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, Bobby's widow, Ethel, was deputized to call Mary Jo's parents. Ethel told them, as a recent widow and fellow Catholic who had welcomed Mary Jo into her and Bobby's home many times, that she knew loss, that faith was a comfort, and that, rest assured, the Kennedys would be attending Mary Jo's funeral. On July 22nd, 1969, hundreds gathered to watch the funeral procession. In Catholic tradition, hers was an open casket. She was dressed in a long blue gown with a rosary laced between her hands. In the front pew sat Ted, wearing a neck brace he did not need, and Joan and Ethel Kennedy. Well, I'm going to show you this photo because it is ridiculous. This is all part of his act. He shows up to the funeral with his pregnant wife, and he is wearing this stupid neck collar that he does not need in order to gain sympathy. Joan, his wife, had been told by doctors not to fly, that her pregnancy was too fragile, but she defied them. What would the press think if she didn't go? Her absence would only fuel the rumors that Ted was having sex with Mary Jo, or had planned to that night. Yet Mary Jo in American media was still nameless. She was, quote, the victim drawn to politics in the New York Times, or the girl in Ted Kennedy's car in Ladies' Home Journal, the blonde who drowned, New York Daily News. She was the expendable woman whose death, quote, made Ted a man, New York Times. Ted had promised that he would tell Jo and Gwen Kopechne what happened that night when he was ready. Her parents were dissuaded from exhuming Mary Jo's body and from suing Ted Kennedy. But as the years passed with no explanation or answers and no justice for their daughter, Gwen began self-medicating with Valium. Her father, who kept all of his anguish bottled up inside, eventually developed stomach cancer. They spent their lives tending to Mary Jo's grave and her memory while fielding calls from Ted Kennedy every few years, asking them to quietly support his latest election bid. As ever, he kept holding out the empty promise that someday, one day, he would tell them the truth. The Boiler Room girls refused to talk to Gwen and Jo about Mary Jo's last weekend alive, or what they saw and heard in the aftermath. None of them told Mary Jo's parents why some of them remembered seeing her leave the party that night at different times, or not at all, only for all of them to recall in official testimony that they saw her leave between 11 and 11:15 that night. So if that passage wasn't clear, they all remembered her leaving at different times, and some of them didn't remember her leaving at all. But in official testimony, they all say they saw her leave between 11 and 11:15. No other media outlet picked up an explosive report in the Washington Post by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, fresh off Watergate, that the surviving Boiler Room girls may have been the targets of blackmail, possibly by Ted's enemies. The expose focused on a New York City apartment rented by a former White House secret investigator, which he claimed was for establishing a private detective office for confidential investigations. However, the article read, sources say that the apartment was furnished with velvet wallpaper and fur rugs, hardly the decor for a private detective agency. Government attorneys had been told that the apartment was to be used to seduce female friends of the late Mary Jo Kopechne. The scheme involved hiring a good-looking man to seduce the woman in the apartment and have secret pictures taken, and then blackmail women into revealing details about Miss Chappaquidick and the party that took place shortly before the Chappaquidick accident. What, if anything, resulted from that scheme remains unknown. Well, I'll tell you guys one thing that I think was going on. I don't know who it was that was doing this, but I will say that honeypot schemes, which is what this is when sexual lures are used to try to gain information, whether that's in a spying situation or a government situation, it's called a honeypot scheme. And whoever was doing this was obviously seeking to gain information. And, could it have been Ted himself and his lackeys? Could it have been someone opposed to him? Could it have been someone in a different government? We're not told. But obviously we've already talked about this. I think Epstein and his folks, they are a modern version of this, but certainly J. Edgar Hoover at this time in the 50s, 60s, 70s was a classic user of honeypot schemes, and they used sexual blackmail all the time in these three-letter agencies, whether it was the FBI or CIA or OSS or whoever. They used honeypot schemes for sure. Not that any of it mattered. Ted had been protected from the beginning. The judge that presided over the hearing was a longtime Kennedy family friend. Ted's crisis managers had all worked and written speeches for Jack and Bobby. The bulk of the on-scene reporters were all men. The first historian of Chappaquidick was secure in the Kennedy pocket. Here's what he said. What had Mary Jo been doing with Senator Ted Kennedy that night? The obvious answer was that they were playing around in the weeds, he said. She's had a few drinks, she's very giddy and excited, she's with a Kennedy, a lifelong dream. He's probably loving her up a little. Just to be in the car with him in the middle of the night on a deserted island, she must have been beside herself with excitement, a spinster girl. What was she, 28? This is so dismissive and ridiculous for this man to reduce Mary Jo, who had served on a presidential campaign and had achieved her own level of respect in the consulting world, which is not easy to do, by the way. But she's a little girl being loved up in the back of a car and probably beside herself with excitement. It's so gross. Well, Mary Jo had been a week away from turning 29 when she died. In the Kennedy version, Mary Jo died a temptress, a seductress, a slut, and a Kennedy groupie. Maureen Callahan writes, in all likelihood, she died a virgin. So Maureen leaves us to sort out for ourselves. Was she heading to the mainland with Ted? Was she going willingly? Or was she drunk? Was she planning to share his room? Was she planning to have her own room and she just forgot the key and she was going to hope that the hotel clerk would let her in? Had she unintentionally fallen asleep, like Ted didn't even know she was there? Was there something else? For this episode, I want to share a little bit of the evidence that Maureen Callahan shares at the back. She talks about talking with Mary Jo Kopechne's cousin, and so she got a lot of backstory about Mary Jo's childhood from them. There is a quote from Mary Jo's father, Joe Kopechne. He spoke to the Women's News Service in July 1979, which was 10 years after she died. Right about the time that Ted Kennedy is about to announce a run for president, Joe says, so this is Mary Jo Kopechne's father, "I'll never forgive him. I don't believe the truth has been told. I don't know the truth. None of us knows the truth." So that's interesting. And then there is the oral history given by Nance Lyons, who was one of the boiler room girls. And this is something that she wrote. She said, "I have never discussed the tragedy at Chappaquidick. The events of that weekend were tragic. Mary Jo was my roommate. I knew her parents. Chappaquidick changed my life. First, the women who had had significant responsibility in the national campaign for Bobby Kennedy were portrayed as girls of no significance, even as party girls. It was humiliating, and no one bothered to set the record straight. Then, for the next 10 to 12 years, on each anniversary, we were pursued by the press, subjected to hate mail, and had our work demeaned, as well as veiled accusations thrown at us. Even though I returned to work within 10 feet of his office, Ted Kennedy never asked how I was doing or said how sorry he was that I or the other women were subjected to such scrutiny. He never mentioned Mary Jo to me. No thank yous for supporting him during these trying times. To me, this was unbelievable, and I have not forgiven him for that insensitivity. The women from Chappaquidick suffered greatly, both personally and professionally. Some lost jobs, and some didn't get jobs. So I just wanted to read that so you would know some of the evidence that went into her perspective. So this is the story of Mary Jo Kopechne. What do you guys think about Ted's actions in the hours past the car crash? And what do you think was Mary Jo's choice in the matter? Also, what do you think of the nature of her relationship with RFK? Do you believe that it was not sexual, that it was sexual? It appears that Maureen Callahan believes that she very likely was a virgin when she died. I have 2 quick promos to do. The first is that the next episode is going to be a bonus episode. Y'all, I went into a thrift store last week before we left for Colorado, and I found this little pack of Life magazines. The first one that caught my eye was this one, which is JFK Jr. and his sister Caroline. So that seemed kind of neat. But the one that we are going to unbox together, and I haven't unwrapped it yet, is this one, which is the week after all of this happened. The Life magazine, it says, "The fateful turn for Ted Kennedy, grave questions about his midnight car accident." So this is what we are going to do on the next little bonus episode. So it will not be a chapter, it will just be a bonus episode. I will try to release that in between, but we will still be on a Sunday, Wednesday publishing schedule. And then the last thing I have to say is that the next episode is about Ted's wife, who is the other blonde, Ted's blondes, which is Joan Bennett Kennedy. So you guys have a great day. Thanks for hanging with me with all that reading, and I look forward to opening this with you. Bye.